The year was 1967, and the music industry was changing faster than anyone could have predicted. Rock and roll had exploded into something bigger, louder, and more rebellious than the generation before it ever imagined possible. Rhythm and blues was evolving. Soul music was reaching new emotional heights. And somewhere in the middle of all that transformation, two worlds were about to collide, not on a stage, not in a recording studio, but in a room full of the most powerful people in American music. What happened that evening has been described differently by different people who were there. Some say it was a minor moment, a passing comment that meant nothing. Others say it was the kind of thing that leaves a mark. Not a bruise you can see, but the kind that settles into the chest and stays there for years. What is not disputed is this: Ray Charles, one of the most celebrated and respected musicians alive, said something about Janis Joplin that night, and Janis Joplin heard it. She never forgot it. But before we get to that room, before we get to that evening and what was said and what it meant and what came after, we need to understand who these two people were. Not the legends, not the icons, the human beings, because this is not a story about two names on a marquee. This is a story about two completely different visions of what music is supposed to be, and what happens when those visions meet and clash. Ray Charles was born in Georgia in 1930. He lost his sight by the age of 7. He learned music not as a hobby, not as an escape, but as a survival tool, a way of understanding and navigating a world that had taken one of his most basic senses away from him. By the time he was a teenager, he was already playing professionally. By the time he was in his 20s, he had begun doing something that no one in American music had quite done before, fusing gospel with rhythm and blues in a way that made church mothers furious and nightclub audiences weep. He called it soul. The music industry called it revolutionary. By the mid-1960s, Ray Charles was not simply a musician. He was an institution. He had crossed every boundary that was supposed to be uncrossable. He had taken country music and made it his own. He had taken pop standards and rebuilt them from the inside. He had collaborated with orchestras, with jazz ensembles, with country singers and classical composers. He had won Grammy Awards. He had sold out concert halls across the United States and Europe. He was, by almost any measure you could apply, one of the greatest musicians who had ever lived. And he knew it, not in an arrogant way, exactly. Ray Charles was not a man who needed to put others down to feel tall, but he had standards. Ferocious, uncompromising standards. He had spent decades earning the right to those standards, and he applied them to everything he heard. He could not afford sentimentality about music. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, and climbed too steep a mountain to pretend that everything was equally good. Some things were extraordinary. Some things were competent, and some things were simply not for him. Now let us talk about Janis Joplin. Janis Joplin was born in Port Arthur, Texas in 1943. She grew up 13 years after Ray Charles in a completely different America. But in some ways she shared more with him than their surface differences suggested. Both of them were outsiders. Both of them were people whom the mainstream did not quite know what to do with. Both of them found their identity not through acceptance, but through music. Through the discovery that sound could carry the weight of everything they were not allowed to say out loud. But where Ray Charles had found his voice early, had built it carefully, had refined it over decades of professional discipline, Janis Joplin had come to hers explosively, chaotically, like a wildfire that did not wait for permission to spread. She had grown up being mocked. In high school in Port Arthur, she was called ugly. She was called weird. She was nominated as a joke for a homecoming court. The cruelty of small towns toward anyone who does not fit the expected shape is well documented, and Janis Joplin experienced it with a particular intensity. She was too loud, too opinionated, too strange, too interested in music that no one around her cared about. Bessie Smith, Lid Belly, Odetta. The great blues singers whose records she found in bins and listened to alone in her room. She left Texas for San Francisco, and San Francisco in the mid-1960s was a city that had decided to reinvent everything. The counterculture was not a movement yet. It was a feeling, a gathering of people who had decided that the old rules no longer applied. Janis found her people there. She found Big Brother and the Holding Company, a rock band that played with the kind of beautiful, organized chaos that matched something she had been carrying inside her for years. And then she sang, the moment that changed everything. The moment when the music industry went from ignoring Janis Joplin to being unable to look away from her came at the Monterey Pop Festival in June of 1967. She walked onto that stage as someone most of the industry had not heard of. She walked off it as someone no one would ever forget. Her performance of Ball and Chain has been described by almost everyone who witnessed it as one of the most raw, visceral, emotionally overwhelming experiences they had ever seen on a stage. Mama Cass Elliot, sitting in the audience, was filmed watching with her mouth open, shaking her head in what looked like absolute disbelief. Janis Joplin had arrived, and the industry had no category for her. That was always part of the problem. The music industry in 1967 had categories, and those categories mattered. You were a rock singer or a blues singer or a soul singer or a pop singer. You were polished or raw, but you were one or the other. You understood the tradition or you did not. Janis Joplin defied all of those categories simultaneously. She was a white woman from Texas, singing with the emotional vocabulary of the great black blues singers she had grown up worshiping. She was raw in a way that made some people uncomfortable and moved others to tears. She was technically imperfect and emotionally overwhelming, a combination that the traditionalists in the industry struggled to process. Ray Charles was a traditionalist, not in a conservative sense. His entire career had been built on breaking tradition, but he was a traditionalist in the sense that he believed music required craft, required precision, required a relationship between the artist and the form that went beyond pure emotion. Feeling alone was not enough. You had to know how to channel the feeling, how to shape it, how to make it land. This is where the two philosophies diverged. The evening in question took place in the fall of 1967. In the months after Monterey, when Janis Joplin's name was suddenly everywhere. The exact setting has been described in various ways by various sources, but the essential facts remain consistent. It was an industry gathering, the kind of event where record executives and established artists and rising names all occupied the same space, and where reputations were built and damaged in casual conversation. Ray Charles was there. Janis Joplin was there. At some point during the evening, someone, exactly who varies depending on who is telling the story, brought up Janis Joplin's performance at Monterey. They spoke about it with enthusiasm, with the energy of people who had witnessed something new and were still processing what it meant. Ray Charles listened, and then Ray Charles responded. What he said was something to the effect that what Janis did was not singing in any technical sense. He recognized that screaming was not a substitute for control. That raw emotion without craft was not art. It was simply noise that happened to move people who did not know the difference. He was not cruel about it. Ray Charles was rarely cruel, but he was direct and he was dismissive, and he said it in a room full of people who mattered in the music industry. Janis Joplin was either in that room or heard about it very shortly afterward. Accounts differ on the precise geography of the moment. What all accounts agree on is that she found out what he had said, and that it hit her hard. Here is what you need to understand about why it hit her hard. It was not simply the criticism. Janis Joplin had been criticized her entire life. She had been told she was too much, too loud, too raw, too strange, too everything. She had built a kind of armor from those criticisms, had learned to wear them as proof that she was doing something real. Criticism from people who wanted her to be smaller was easy to dismiss. But Ray Charles was not asking her to be smaller. Ray Charles was questioning whether what she did was music at all. And Ray Charles was not some executive who did not understand what it felt like to stand on a stage and bleed. Ray Charles was a man whose relationship with music was as deep and as painful and as real as anything Janis Joplin had ever felt. He had earned his authority through suffering and discipline and genius in equal measure. When someone you respect says something that cuts you, it lands differently than when someone you dismiss says the same thing. Janis went home that night, or whatever home meant to her in that period of her life, the hotels and apartments and crash pads that constituted a life lived in motion. And she did not sleep well. People who knew her in that period have described the way she processed things loudly at first, all noise and defiance, and then quietly, in the hours when the noise died down and she was alone with whatever she actually felt. She could not pretend that Ray Charles was wrong about everything. That was the hardest part. She knew she was not technically precise. She knew there were notes she could not hit cleanly, runs she could not execute the way a trained vocalist could. She had never claimed otherwise, but she had always believed, had built her entire identity around the belief that what she could do instead was something that mattered just as much, maybe more. She could make people feel things they had forgotten they were allowed to feel. She could take the weight of a room and lift it or crush it or crack it open with her voice alone. Was that not worth something? Was that not, in its own way, a form of mastery? The argument she was having with herself in the quiet of those nights was an argument that has never really been resolved in music. It is the tension between technique and truth, between craft and feeling, between the school that says music is a discipline and the school that says music is a liberation. Both sides have giants. Both sides have produced work that has outlasted generations. Ray Charles himself was living proof that the two things did not have to be mutually exclusive. His genius was precisely that he had both, the technical command and the emotional devastation, working together in a way that made the distinction seem irrelevant. But Janis Joplin could not do what Ray Charles did. She could not have both in the same way. She had to choose, or rather, she had already chosen without knowing she was choosing, had built herself around the feeling rather than the form. And now the greatest living example of someone who had managed to have both was telling her that her choice was not enough. She could have let it break her. There were people in her life during that period who worried that she would. Janis had a complicated relationship with her own worth, a relationship that had been shaped by years of being told she was not quite right. The drinking, which was already a presence in her life by 1967, was in part a way of managing the volume of everything she felt. The criticism from Ray Charles was exactly the kind of thing that could turn the volume up. Instead, something different happened. Whether it was defiance or determination or some mixture of the two that only Janis herself could have fully articulated. She went back to work. Not in a dramatic, revenge-fueled way. Janis Joplin was not the kind of person who announced her comebacks. She simply kept going. She kept playing. She kept screaming, if that is what Ray Charles wanted to call it. She kept doing the things she did with an intensity that, if anything, increased in the months following that evening. The work she produced in 1968 was some of the most extraordinary of her career. The album, Cheap Thrills, recorded with Big Brother and the Holding Company and released in August of 1968, reached #1 on the Billboard charts. It contained performances, particularly Piece of My Heart and Summertime, that remain, more than 5 decades later, among the most discussed vocal performances in the history of recorded music. Not because they were technically perfect. They were not technically perfect, but they were true in a way that few things in music ever achieve. Musicologists and critics who have studied that album in the years since have noted something interesting. There is a quality in Janis Joplin's vocals on Cheap Thrills that is difficult to name but impossible to miss. It is a kind of urgency, a sense that she is singing as if something depends on it, as if the song is not a performance but a necessity. Some of them have speculated, carefully, because these things cannot be proven. That part of what drove that urgency was precisely the experience of being dismissed by people she respected. Being told you cannot do something by someone whose opinion you value does one of two things to a person. It either confirms what you secretly feared and shuts you down, or it locates something in you that was already there but had not yet been fully activated. For Janis Joplin, in the fall of 1967, it appears to have done the latter. Ray Charles, for his part, was not following Janis Joplin's career with any particular attention in those months. He had his own work, his own projects, his own world. The comment he had made was, from his perspective, simply an honest assessment, the kind of thing he said regularly about music he encountered and found wanting. He was not a man who said things he did not mean, and he was not a man who spent time regretting honest opinions, but the music industry has a way of bringing people's words back to them. By 1968, Cheap Thrills was impossible to ignore. It was on the radio, in the record stores, in the conversations of everyone who paid attention to where American music was going. People who had been in that room the previous fall, people who had heard what Ray Charles said, were now hearing "Piece of My Heart" and having a complicated experience. Because whatever Ray Charles had said about screaming and craft and noise, what was coming out of that record was not easy to dismiss. There are accounts, again, told differently by different people, because this is the nature of music industry history, that Ray Charles heard Cheap Thrills during that period and had a more complicated reaction than his earlier dismissal suggested. He was not the kind of man who publicly reversed his positions, but people who knew him have suggested that he listened to what Janis Joplin was doing with something closer to genuine attention after 1968 than he had given it before. This is the part of the story that most people who tell it tend to skip over because it does not fit neatly into either the narrative of vindication or the narrative of ongoing conflict. The truth, as it usually does, resists both of those shapes. Ray Charles was right about some things. Janis Joplin's technique was not orthodox. There were things she could not do that a classically trained vocalist could do without effort. If you applied the metrics that Ray Charles had spent his life mastering, Janis Joplin did not score perfectly. This is simply true, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. Janis Joplin was right about some things. The metrics that Ray Charles had spent his life mastering were not the only metrics that mattered. Music does not exist only to demonstrate technical proficiency. It exists to do something to the person hearing it, to move them, to crack something open in them, to make them feel less alone in whatever they are carrying. By that measure, Janis Joplin was not merely competent. She was extraordinary. The argument between them was not really about Janis Joplin at all. It was about what music is for. It was a question that had no single correct answer, and it was a question that both of them had answered with their lives, differently, completely, and with total commitment to their respective visions. What makes this story worth telling, half a century later, is not who won the argument. Nobody won the argument. The argument is still going on. In recording studios and music schools and concert halls and bedrooms where people listen to music alone and try to understand why some of it reaches them and some of it does not. What makes this story worth telling is what each of them did with the encounter. Ray Charles continued to be Ray Charles. He continued to produce music of astonishing technical and emotional depth. Music that managed to be both perfectly crafted and deeply felt in a way that remained essentially unrepeatable. He continued to be one of the most respected musicians alive, not because he was universally liked, but because he was consistently, undeniably brilliant. Janis Joplin continued to be Janis Joplin. She continued to scream, if that is what you want to call it. She continued to take the weight of whatever she was feeling and pour it directly into the microphone without filtering it, without softening it, without making it more palatable for audiences who might have preferred something easier to hold. She released more music. She played more concerts. She burned with an intensity that the people who saw her live have spent the rest of their lives trying to describe. She died in October of 1970 at the age of 27. The cause was an accidental drug overdose. She had been in the middle of recording what would become her best-selling and most celebrated album, Peril, which was released posthumously in January of 1971 and contained May and Bobby McGee, a song that reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and introduced her voice to an even wider audience after she was gone. Ray Charles outlived her by 34 years. He died in June of 2004 at the age of 73. While in the middle of recording an album of duets that was released posthumously later that year. He spent the last decades of his life continuing to perform, continuing to record, continuing to apply those uncompromising standards to everything he touched. Both of them are in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Both of them appear regularly on lists of the greatest musicians in American history. Both of them changed music in ways that are still being felt today, still being absorbed, still being argued about by people who were not born when either of them was alive. The moment in that room in 1967, Ray Charles's dismissal, Janis Joplin's hearing of it, was not the whole story of either of them. It was one moment in two enormous lives, two careers that contained multitudes. But it was the kind of moment that reveals something true about both people, something that their music alone cannot quite show you. Ray Charles believed in music as a discipline. He believed that feeling without form was incomplete, that the greatest art was the art that had both, the technique to execute and the soul to mean it. He was not wrong about this. Some of the most enduring music ever made was made by people who had both things in abundance. Janis Joplin believed in music as a necessity. She believed that form without feeling was decoration, that the point of standing in front of people and opening your mouth was to give them something real, something unpolished, something that had not been processed into safety. She was not wrong about this either. Some of the most enduring music ever made was made by people who had nothing but the feeling and the willingness to let it destroy them in public. They were both right. They were both incomplete without the other, and neither of them would have thanked you for pointing that out. The night after that industry gathering in 1967, Janis Joplin is said to have gone back to wherever she was staying and played records for hours. Not her own records. Bessie Smith, Lyd Belly, the singers who had taught her that feeling was enough, that truth was enough, that the body's ability to channel pain into sound was not a lesser art, but the oldest art, the most human art, the art that existed before anyone thought to give it rules. She played those records and she listened, and she remembered why she had started in the first place, not to impress Ray Charles, not to satisfy any standard that had been handed down from people who had decided what music was supposed to be. She had started because she had no other way to be in the world without breaking apart. She had started because the sound was the only place where everything she was made sense, and then she went back to work. That is the story. Not a story of a villain and a hero, not a story of right and wrong, a story of two people who both loved music fiercely, completely, and differently, who met briefly in the collision of those two visions, and who each went on to leave something behind that the world is still listening to. Ray Charles dismissed Janis Joplin in front of the music industry. Janis Joplin never forgot it. What she did with the memory is what you have just been listening to. What she left behind is what you can still hear today, if you want to. Press play on anything she recorded. Turn it up and ask yourself whether what you hear is screaming or singing. The answer, of course, is both. The answer was always both. And maybe that is the thing neither of them ever quite said to each other. In that room in 1967, or anywhere else, that the line between screaming and singing, between technique and truth, between craft and feeling is not a wall. It is a place where the most extraordinary things happen. The place where Ray Charles lived, the place where Janis Joplin lived, two different addresses on the same